You weren't set lucky. You weren't set protected by accident. And you didn't survive everything just to stay the same. What you went through was not punishment. It was examination. Every delay you hated, every silence that confused you, every moment you thought you were being ignored, was measuring you. Most people fail these tests without ever knowing they existed. They break internally long before life breaks externally. But you didn't set. You stayed steady when clarity disappeared. You stayed disciplined when no one was watching. You stayed grounded when quitting felt justified. That's why something feels different now. The weight is lifting, the noise is fading, and movement is starting again. Because the truth is this: you passed every test perfectly, and what comes next is not a reward you chase. It sets a life that finally responds. Stay with me, because these 7 lessons will explain why everything is about to change. The tests were designed specifically for you. What you went through was not random chaos. It wasn't set bad luck. It wasn't life being unfair for no reason. It was precision. Every challenge you faced was engineered to measure something inside you, something most people never develop. The pressure you felt wasn't meant to crush you. It was meant to reveal you. Here is what most people misunderstand about tests. They are never general. They are always personal. You were tested in the exact areas that mattered most to your growth. Not where you were strongest, but where you were most vulnerable. Your patience was stretched when you were already tired. Your faith was tested when clarity disappeared. Your self-worth was challenged when validation was removed. Your discipline was examined when shortcuts were right in front of you. That's not coincidence. That's design. If the test had been easier, it wouldn't have exposed your depth. If it had been harder, it would have destroyed you. The fact that you survived means the test was calibrated perfectly to your capacity, even when you didn't believe you had that capacity. And notice this: you weren't tested once. You were tested repeatedly. Different situations, same pressure. That repetition wasn't punishment. It was confirmation. The test kept coming back because you were passing, not failing. Life only repeats lessons for 2 reasons: to teach those who don't learn, and to strengthen those who are being prepared for something larger. You were in the second category. Every time you wanted to quit but didn't, you passed. Every time you could have become reckless but chose restraint, you passed. Every time bitterness tried to take root and you refused it, you passed. Every time you stood alone without applause and still moved forward, you passed. Passing doesn't mean you felt confident. Passing doesn't mean you understood what was happening. Passing doesn't mean you were calm the whole time. Passing means you stayed aligned under pressure. Most people collapse internally long before their circumstances change. They lose integrity. They lose patience. They lose themselves. You didn't. That's the part no one saw. You held your ground when outcomes were uncertain. You stayed disciplined when rewards were delayed. You remained consistent when results were invisible. That is rare, and here rests the most important truth of this lesson. The test wasn't about the situation. It was about who you became while enduring it. Life wasn't asking, "Can you win?" It was asking, "Can you remain stable, ethical, patient, and self-controlled when winning is not guaranteed?" You answered that question with your behavior. That's why the test ended quietly. That's why the pressure is easing now. That's why the environment is shifting. Because once your inner structure was proven strong enough, the test had no reason to continue. You weren't being broken. You were being measured. And you passed. Not barely, not accidentally, not temporarily. You passed perfectly. Silence was the hardest test, and you passed it. There is no test more brutal than silence. Pain hurts, but silence confuses. Struggle exhausts, but silence unsettles. Loss wounds, but silence makes you question everything. And that was your test. You weren't set tested when things were loud. You weren't set tested when guidance was clear. You were tested when nothing answered back. No signs, no reassurance, no confirmation that you were on the right path. Just days where effort felt unseen, nights where prayers felt unanswered, moments where progress felt imaginary. This is where most people fail, not because they're weak, but because silence attacks the mind differently. It creates doubt. It whispers stories. It makes you question your worth, your direction, and even your sanity. Silence asks one terrifying question over and over again. Am I doing all this for nothing? Most people panic here. They rush for noise. They chase validation. They abandon discipline. They betray their own values just to feel something change. But you didn't stay. You stayed steady without guarantees. You kept moving when motivation disappeared. You remained disciplined when enthusiasm died. You stayed ethical when no one was rewarding you for it. That is not normal strength. That is inner authority. Silence wasn't abandonment. Silence was the exam. It was testing whether you could trust without proof, stay consistent without praise, remain aligned without applause. And here's the part that matters most. You didn't just survive the silence. You grew comfortable inside it. At some point, the noise stopped controlling you. You stopped needing constant feedback. You stopped interpreting silence as failure. That moment changed everything. Because once silence no longer scares you, you become unshakable. You stop reacting. You stop rushing. You stop forcing outcomes. You begin to move with quiet confidence. That sets when the test ends. Not when answers arrive, but when you no longer need them to continue. The silence didn't mean nothing was happening. It meant everything important was happening inside you. Your patience deepened. Your emotional control sharpened. Your self-trust solidified. Most people collapse inwardly long before results show up. They leak energy through anxiety, overthinking, and desperation. You didn't leak. You held your composure when clarity was delayed. You remained grounded when direction was blurred. You stayed consistent when motivation was gone. That's why the silence eventually lifted. Not because you begged, not because you forced it, but because you passed the moment silence was no longer able to break you. Silence only stays until it finishes its work, and with you, it finished. That's why movement is starting now. That's why signs feel closer. That's why clarity is slowly returning. You didn't fail in the quiet. You mastered it. And that mastery is exactly why what comes next won't shake you. When life speaks again, you will be ready to hear it. You didn't become bitter. That's extremely rare. Pain changes people. Most don't notice when it happens. One disappointment turns into caution. One betrayal turns into walls. One unfair moment turns into anger. Slowly, quietly, people harden. They stop trusting. They stop feeling. They stop caring the same way. That was one of your biggest tests, and you didn't even realize it at the time. You were hurt. You were disappointed. You were let down in ways that cut deep, and you had every reason to become bitter. You could have justified it. You could have blamed the world. You could have decided that being cold was safer than being open. Most people do. But you didn't. Instead of letting pain turn into poison, you processed it. You felt it without letting it define you. You acknowledged the hurt without building your identity around it. That's rare, because bitterness feels powerful at first. It gives the illusion of control. It makes people feel protected, but in reality, it traps them in the very pain they're trying to escape. You chose differently. You didn't let resentment rewrite your character. You didn't let anger become your personality. You didn't let disappointment turn into cruelty. That restraint mattered more than you know. You stayed human in situations that could have made you hostile. You stayed grounded when it would have been easy to lash out. You stayed principled when being ruthless looked tempting. That's SEP's not weakness. That's SEP's emotional mastery. Bitterness is easy. Anyone can become bitter. Staying soft without becoming fragile, that takes strength. And here sips the hidden part of the test. You weren't being tested on how much pain you could endure. You were being tested on what kind of person you would become while enduring it. Would you let pain shrink you, or would you let it deepen you? You chose depth. You learned boundaries without losing compassion. You learned discernment without losing empathy. You learned self-respect without losing humility. That balance is extremely rare. Most people swing to extremes. They either stay naive or become hardened. You evolved. And because you didn't become bitter, you kept your ability to receive what's next. Bitterness blocks growth. It closes doors. It distorts perception. You stayed clear. That's why new opportunities feel different now. That's why peace feels real. That's why your future isn't poisoned by your past. The test wasn't set about surviving pain. It was about whether pain would rewrite you. It didn't stay. And because you protected your inner world, your outer world is finally ready to respond. You passed a test most people fail without ever knowing it existed. You were being watched more than you ever realized. This was never just about what happened to you. That's the part most people misunderstand. The real test wasn't the loss. It wasn't the delay. It wasn't the pressure, the rejection, or the isolation. Those were only the stage. The real test was how you behaved when no one was clapping, guiding, or correcting you. Because there is a level of testing where guidance disappears on purpose. Not because you set or abandoned, but because you serve being observed. You were watched in moments when you could sieve lied and no one would sieve known. You could sieve taken shortcuts without consequences. You could sieve reacted emotionally and justified it. And that's where most people fail. They assume tests only exist when rules are visible. They assume accountability only exists when someone is watching. But the highest level of testing happens in private. When no authority is present. When no reward is guaranteed. When no punishment seems immediate. That's when character speaks loudest. And you were tested there repeatedly. How did you respond when you were misunderstood? Did you defend your ego or control it? How did you respond when you were treated unfairly? Did you become reckless or remain disciplined? How did you respond when people doubted you? Did you over-explain or stay grounded? Those moments mattered far more than the outcome itself. Because outcomes can be manipulated. Reactions cannot be faked for long, and you chose self-control over chaos. That alone separated you from most people. You didn't win every situation, but you won yourself. You didn't always feel calm, but you remained composed. You didn't always understand the reason, but you stayed aligned with your values. That sets the difference between people who rise temporarily and people who are trusted with longevity. You see, pressure reveals instincts. When pressure rises, most people become defensive, become impulsive, become reactive. They leak energy through arguments, explanations, and emotional outbursts. You didn't that. You paused when reacting would have been easier. You observed when speaking would have been tempting. You chose restraint when retaliation felt justified. That restraint wasn't weakness. It was evidence of maturity. And maturity is always watched. Because power is never given to those who lose control under pressure. Influence is never handed to those who collapse emotionally. Expansion never comes to those who betray their integrity when tested. You were being assessed for trustworthiness, not comfort. That's why the tests felt unfair. Unfair tests are designed to see whether you'll compromise your standards when circumstances don't favor you. You didn't. You stayed consistent, even when consistency cost you. You didn't abandon your ethics just because no one was enforcing them. You didn't become arrogant when you were ahead. You didn't become cruel when you were hurt. That combination is extremely rare. Most people are only disciplined when consequences are visible. You were disciplined even when they weren't set. And that's why the shift is happening now. Because once your inner stability was proven under pressure, the test had no reason to continue. You passed not because you were perfect, but because you were self-governed. That sets the highest level of readiness. When you don't need to be managed. When you don't need to be corrected. When you don't need constant reminders to stay aligned. You demonstrated internal authority. And once that's established, life changes the rules. The observation phase ends. The preparation phase closes. The positioning phase begins. What comes next? One must require the same tests. Because you already proved who you are when it mattered most. Not in public, not on display, but in silence. And that's why your life is shifting now. You weren't just surviving circumstances. You were earning trust. And trust always precedes elevation. You stopped needing validation. That was the turning point. There was a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when something inside you shifted. Nothing dramatic happened on the outside. No applause, no announcement, no sudden breakthrough. But internally, something ended. You stopped waiting for permission. You stopped needing people to understand you. You stopped explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped measuring your worth through reactions, likes, praise, or approval. And that moment, whether you realized it or not, ended the test. Because validation seeking is one of the most subtle traps in human life. It disguises itself as humility. It pretends to be politeness. It wears the mask of just wanting to be seen. But underneath, it sets dependency. As long as you need validation, your direction is never fully yours. Your emotions are outsourced. Your confidence fluctuates with opinions. Your peace is negotiable. And that's exactly what the test was targeting. You were placed in situations where you weren't acknowledged for your effort. Your intentions were misunderstood. Your growth went unnoticed. Your sacrifices weren't rewarded. Not to punish you, but to see whether you would collapse internally without recognition. Most people do. They start performing for approval. They compromise their values for acceptance. They become louder, more reactive, more desperate to be noticed. But you didn't sit. At first it hurt. You questioned yourself. You wondered if you were invisible. But then, something remarkable happened. You realized that needing validation was costing you more than not receiving it. It was draining your energy, distorting your decisions, pulling you away from your own center. So you let it go. You stopped chasing acknowledgement. You stopped correcting every misunderstanding. You stopped trying to control how people perceived you. That wasn't resignation. That was sovereignty. You didn't shrink. You stabilized. You became internally anchored. And here sits the truth most people never learn. The moment you no longer need validation, you become powerful because nothing external can destabilize you anymore. You stopped living reactively. You stopped adjusting yourself to be palatable. You stopped performing versions of yourself for different audiences. You became consistent. That consistency is rare. Most people live fractured lives, one version for approval, one version in private, one version for survival. You unified, and unity is strength. From that point forward, your decisions came from clarity, not craving. Your silence came from confidence, not fear. Your discipline came from self-respect, not pressure. That's when the environment started responding differently, not loudly, not immediately, but subtly. You noticed less emotional chaos, more internal calm, clearer boundaries, stronger intuition. You became harder to manipulate, not because you were guarded, but because you were grounded. People sensed it too. Some drifted away. Some grew uncomfortable. Some suddenly respected you. That's always the sign. When validation no longer controls you, relationships reorganize themselves. What was built on approval collapses. What fades built on alignment remains. And this is the turning point most people never reach. Because letting go of validation feels like death to the ego. It feels like disappearing. It feels like being misunderstood forever. But in reality, it's freedom. You don't disappear. You consolidate. You don't become invisible. You become undeniable. You no longer need to be chosen because you chose yourself. That's when life changes how it treats you. Opportunities begin approaching you instead of being chased. Respect becomes quieter but deeper. Movement becomes smoother because power does not respond to desperation. It responds to stability. And you became stable. You demonstrated that you could hold your course without applause, that you could stay disciplined without encouragement, that you could remain ethical without reward. That's when the test officially ended. Because once validation no longer governs you, you're trusted with more responsibility, more influence, more expansion. You're no longer reactive. You're no longer easily swayed. You're no longer controllable through praise or rejection. You are self-led, and self-led people don't need constant tests. They become the standard. That's why the pressure eased after this phase. That's why things feel different now. That's why your life is opening in quieter, more precise ways. You didn't lose anything by letting go of validation. You gained authority, and authority is always followed by elevation. That's why this lesson mattered more than you ever knew. You didn't just pass the test. You outgrew it. The reward always arrives quietly before it arrives loudly. Most people believe rewards look like explosions, sudden success, public recognition, instant breakthroughs. But that belief is exactly why most people miss the moment their reward actually begins. Because real rewards don't arrive loudly. They arrive silently. They arrive as subtle internal shifts, long before the external world reflects them. And that silence is intentional because it's the final filter. You see, if the reward came loudly first, it would attract the wrong version of you. It would amplify ego, not readiness. It would reward hunger, not stability. So the reward always comes inside first. And with you, it already has. It arrived the moment your mind stopped racing. It arrived the moment your emotions stopped swinging violently. It arrived the moment your reactions slowed down and your clarity sharpened. That calm you feel now, that grounded presence, that quiet confidence, that not nothing, that's the reward phase beginning. Most people overlook it because it doesn't look impressive. There's no audience, no validation, no proof. But internally, everything changes. Your nervous system settles. Your thoughts become cleaner. Your intuition becomes clearer. You're no longer operating from urgency. You're no longer driven by fear of missing out. You're no longer chasing outcomes. You're moving with intention. And intention always precedes impact. This phase is where many people sabotage themselves because it feels anticlimactic. They think nothing is happening. They grow impatient. They try to force results. You didn't sit. You allowed the quiet. You respected the subtle shift instead of demanding fireworks. That alone shows maturity, because this internal reward is not comfort, it's calibration. Your system was being tuned to handle what's coming next. More responsibility, more visibility, more influence, more weight. And without inner calm, those things destroy people. You see it everywhere. People who get recognition before regulation burn out. People who get power before patience self-destruct. People who get visibility before stability collapse under pressure. That's why the reward comes quietly first. to test whether you'll stay grounded when there's no proof yet. And you passed that test too. You didn't instead grow arrogant. You didn't rush ahead. You didn't announce yourself prematurely. You stayed centered. And that's the final signal life looks for before allowing momentum to build. Because once momentum starts externally, it moves fast. It attracts attention. It amplifies everything. And you needed to be internally ready before that happened. This quiet phase also rewired your relationship with time. You stopped rushing. You stopped feeling behind. You stopped measuring your progress against others. You became patient without becoming passive. That balance is rare. Most people either rush blindly or wait helplessly. You learned how to move calmly and deliberately. That's why your decisions now feel cleaner. That fits why your boundaries feel stronger. That's why your confidence feels steady rather than loud. You're no longer fueled by desperation. You're fueled by clarity. And clarity is power. Another sign the reward phase has begun is detachment. You noticed that certain outcomes no longer control your emotions. You noticed that rejection doesn't destabilize you. You noticed that delays don't trigger panic. That's not numbness. That's emotional regulation. And emotional regulation is the foundation of long-term success in any domain. This phase also sharpened your intuition. You sense when to move and when to wait. You sense what aligns and what drains you. You sense when something is forced versus when it flows. That awareness didn't come from thinking harder. It came from being still long enough to listen. And because you didn't interrupt this phase, it completed its work. Now, and only now, external movement can begin. Opportunities don't rush you anymore. They approach you. Momentum doesn't feel chaotic. It feels directed. Change doesn't feel overwhelming. It feels earned. This is why what fists coming one tit shake you. You've already been rewarded with the one thing most people never develop: inner stability. And inner stability changes everything. It changes how you handle pressure. It changes how you handle attention. It changes how you handle responsibility. That's why the reward didn't just come as noise. It came as silence. Because silence prepared you to handle sound. And now, as things begin to move outwardly, you once lose yourself in the process. You once become reactive. You once become reckless. You once become dependent on the outcome. You so remain anchored. And anchored people don't just rise temporarily. They rise sustainably. That's why this lesson matters so deeply. The reward already arrived, just not in the form you expected. And because you respected it, you were ready for what comes next. This wasn't the end. It was authorization. Most people believe that passing a test means rest, relief, comfort, a long pause where nothing is demanded anymore. But that belief is exactly why most people never move beyond preparation. Because the highest tests don't end with comfort. They end with authorization. And that's what happened to you. What you passed wasn't a finish line. It was a clearance. A signal that you're now trusted to operate at a higher level, without supervision, without constant correction, without training wheels. That's why the pressure didn't disappear completely. It simply changed shape. Before, the pressure was about survival. Now it's about responsibility. Before, you were being tested for endurance. Now you steer being positioned for impact. And that shift is subtle but profound. You may have noticed that life didn't suddenly become easy, but it became clearer. Decisions feel sharper. Boundaries feel firmer. Distractions feel obvious. That's not coincidence. Authorization doesn't remove difficulty. It removes confusion. You no longer being asked, "Can you survive this?" You being asked, "What will you do with what you survived?" That question is heavier, because now your choices carry weight beyond yourself. You are no longer just protecting your peace. You're protecting your integrity, your direction, your influence. And influence doesn't come from loudness. It comes from alignment. That's why this phase requires more precision than effort. You don't need to force outcomes anymore. You need to choose wisely. Because authorization means you are now trusted with more autonomy, more reach, more responsibility, more consequence. That's why shortcuts feel uncomfortable now. That's why compromises feel heavier. That's why misalignment drains you faster. Your internal system upgraded, and upgrades always come with higher standards. You're no longer being corrected externally because you've developed self-correction. You feel it immediately when something is off. You notice when your energy drops. You sense when a path isn't set clean. That sensitivity isn't set weakness. It's sub as calibration. Most people numb themselves to discomfort. You became attentive to it. And that's why your next phase will require intention, not intensity. Authorization also explains why certain doors are closing quietly, not traumatically, not painfully. Just people drift. Opportunities dissolve. Paths lose their pull. That sips not loss. That sips clearance. Because what you're stepping into can't be built on old structures, and life won't drag outdated elements forward once authorization is granted. Another sign of authorization is accountability without pressure. You no longer need motivation to stay disciplined. You don't need fear to stay ethical. You don't need praise to stay consistent. You've internalized your compass. And when that happens, external enforcement becomes unnecessary. That's why this phase feels calmer, but also more serious. You're not being pushed anymore. You're being trusted. Trusted to lead yourself. Trusted to manage your energy. Trusted to choose restraint when impulse arises. And trust always comes with freedom. But freedom isn't steez. Freedom is responsibility without supervision. This is where many people self-sabotage because they confuse freedom with indulgence. You didn't test. You respected the silence. You respected the stillness. You respected the weight of what you earned. That's why the authorization stands. Because authorization isn't about talent. It's about reliability. Can you be consistent when no one is watching? Can you remain ethical when it costs you? Can you stay grounded when momentum increases? You've already proven that. Now the environment will begin to reflect it. Not all at once, not loudly, but steadily. The people who are meant to walk with you will appear. The opportunities aligned with your capacity will surface. The work that matches your maturity will find you. And you won't feel overwhelmed. Because you're no longer trying to become ready. You are ready. This phase doesn't ask you to hustle harder. It asks you to move cleaner. Cleaner decisions. Cleaner commitments. Cleaner focus. Because authorization is fragile if disrespected, but powerful if honored. And here sits the final truth of this lesson. You didn't just pass the test. You proved that you can be trusted with what comes after the test. That's rare. Most people want rewards without responsibility. They want elevation without expectation. You earned both. So if things feel different now, quieter, sharper, more intentional, it sips. Because you're no longer being prepared. You're being deployed. Not loudly, not recklessly, but deliberately. And what you do next matters. Because authorization is not the end of the story. It sets the moment the story finally becomes yours. If this reached you at the right moment, it's because the message was meant for you. The confusion you carried wasn't failure. The silence you endured wasn't rejection. The pressure you survived wasn't punishment. It was preparation. You weren't being tested to see if you could win. You were being tested to see if you could remain yourself when winning wasn't guaranteed. And you did. The phase that broke others refined you. The weight that crushed many shaped you. The silence that ended some strengthened you. So if life feels different now, if your reactions are calmer, if your direction feels clearer, that sip's not coincidence. The test is over. The pressure has shifted, and what comes next will meet you at the level you earned. You don't need to rush. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need permission. Move forward with clarity, with restraint, with confidence. Because you didn't just survive the test. You passed perfectly, and now life responds.